Hey guys, glad you're watching this. I just want to kind of talk through the discussion questions on interpretive maladies since we're going to have a chance to discuss this whole class with our time constraints. And then you'll see a pause about halfway through, and I will transition from just kind of talking here through the questions to highlighting a few of the very nice reader's logs that you guys did. So, interpreter of maladies, right? Definitely not an upper as many of the stories that we read are, right? But it's got a lot of insight into human nature, a lot of flip-flopping of what we think of characters, and maybe make us think by the end of it of some kind of universal themes, and that we might have a little bit of the flaws of some of these characters in ourselves, even though we might look at them almost condescendingly from the point of view of reading the story, right? There's a little bit of usually one of those universal themes in us one way or another, at least as far as not living up to and facing up to the flaws in your own character, or bad experiences that you've had, or bad things that you've done, right? It's hard to look back and accept them. Okay, so the central conflict in the story, and is it resolved by the story's conclusion? So the central conflict in the story is probably really Mr. Kapasi, right? And him dealing with his own loss, and maybe possibly kind of lack of having real closeness, or really intimacy with his own wife, right? Like a lack of happiness, a void, right? So is that resolved by the story's conclusion? I think it's kind of ambiguous, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's a possibility that it's not, right? But there is a glimpse of him not getting something that was going to help him cover that up, as if it was realistic in the first place, right? And we'll kind of circle back to that too. Okay, so 2, how does the plot help illuminate the different cultural viewpoints of Mr. Kapasi and Mr. and Mrs. Das, and which cultural viewpoint is presented with greater sympathy? Okay, there's again no black and white answer here, right? But the author has very unique perspective on this because she's Indian, yet she spent plenty of time in the United Kingdom and America, so she knows what it's like to be kind of an expatriate Indian or someone of Indian descent, who's no longer in India, and tricky things like that, because the culture can be and often is very different depending on how separated you are from your original culture or what your family's culture was, right? So to overgeneralize, he's more formal, right? And he recognizes roles of how parents are supposed to be in his mind, right? Which we kind of go along with that limited third person point of view. In contrast to how the Dasses are, right? They're a lot more casual. He thinks to himself that they seem like they're all siblings, instead of the parents really taking charge of their children, really watching after them and make sure they don't get in trouble and that they're taken care of, eating decently, and things like that. So it's kind of a old world, old-fashioned, traditional place where he comes from. And then the Dasses are obviously a lot more Americanized, right? Now, do they seem like they're maybe kind of shallow, right? And don't think very deeply about things? Well, maybe, but again, that's Das's impression, right? It doesn't mean that they are horrible people. It just means that's how he sees them. But part of the lens through which he sees them is his own guilt and his own hurt over things that have happened in his life. So again, not black and white, right? Okay, how does Mr. Kapasi's job as an interpreter of maladies relate to the action in the story? Well, it's an interesting phrase, right? Because he is an interpreter, but he works in a doctor's office, so that's kind of how that happens, right? He's not someone who figures out maladies as in sicknesses, but he does end up in the position of being in a kind of psychologist counselor position when Mrs. Das reaches out to him about what she's done. And it's crazy, the information that she lets out. It kind of spoils this moment, because he's of course having this kind of romantic fantasy about her, and then she tells him a strange story about her own infidelity, right? And this is where we probably start to get a less sympathetic version of Mrs. Das, because she doesn't really say it in such a way. We feel sorry for her, right? Because she was left alone, and in her culture, it seems, or at least in her family and the arranged marriage that she was in, she ended up home a lot, alone a lot, with like nothing to really do except take care of the babies. And that can be depressing for some people, especially when they're just kind of, sort of pushed into it or expected to be in it. So that's where she is. And she has this fling with her husband's friend. And that's where Ronnie, the boy, came from, right? And so she strangely vents suddenly and lets Mr. Kapasi know this. And he interprets her malady, right? And one word that he uses, do you not want to hurt anymore? Or is it that you just feel guilty, right? And obviously, a big part of it is feeling guilty, right? But she doesn't like that, the way that he says that, because that's making her kind of face up to her own demons. And, from that point, we were probably not too crazy about her, right? But again, it's never black and white, right? Because it's easy for us to say. We didn't end up in the position that she was. And her husband's friend, what kind of position would she have been in if she would have resisted his advances? We don't really know, but he was pretty aggressive, right? Even though she let him. So semi-consensual. It's kind of hard to say. Nobody's there, of course. Okay. Number 4, discuss the significance of Mrs. Doss requesting and then losing Mr. Kapasi's address. I love that part because it seems so cinematic to me. You can just picture that the piece of paper just kind of floating away in slow motion. Apart from its function in the plot, how does this suggest a resolution of the story? So its function in the plot is it pretty much explodes Mr. Kapasi's fantasy, right? It's definitely kind of a symbol too, and some people wrote about how that could be a symbol, which is great because it's a physical object, it's a piece of paper, but it's like Mr. Kapasi's unrealistic, fleeting hopes for some sort of romantic connection, even through mail, literally go fluttering away on this little piece of paper, right? It was an unrealistic fantasy. We know that, right? Deep down inside, he probably knows that too. Okay, 5, how do the characters' views of one another differ from the way the reader is encouraged to view them? That depends on how you read the story. How does this ironic technique help generate suspense? Well, as people slowly reveal themselves, right, then it becomes a little bit of insightful surprise to us, right? Because we sympathize with Mr. Kapasi most of the way through, right? But then at the end, when we realize, the more and more he keeps his fantasy going, we realize it's kind of unhealthy, right? I mean, he is married himself. And then the Dosses, although we might think of them as shallow and we might not technically approve of what she ended up doing with her husband's friend, the way that it happens, we might end up kind of having some sympathy for her, right? It's not like they're horrible people, right? Okay. 6, how do the monkeys in the group encounters in the hill country serve as a plot element helping to advance the story? Well, they kind of become a symbol too. It's like the group of monkeys themselves, I would say, are almost kind of, to look at some of your skills, almost kind of a motif, right? They keep appearing, right? And they get more and more scary, almost as if the monkeys themselves are a physical manifestation of the guilt and the hurt that is haunting each of the characters. Not so much Mr. Doss, right? He's kind of a flat character. He's just there. And not so much the kids, but Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Doss are both haunted by something, right? And when the monkeys surround Ronnie, you notice it's Ronnie they surround, right? It's almost like fate or the gods or her conscience is pointing, don't forget about this, don't forget about what you did, right? I don't think that's any coincidence there. He's the one who gets batted in the leg by one of the monkeys, right? It creates a lot of suspense because you don't really know, especially those of us not from this place, we don't really know whether they're actually going to be harmful and really attack them or not. They sort of do, but nothing absolutely horrible happens, right? But it's creepy, right? And I like that because it kind of reflects the creepiness of how your guilt or your hurt can kind of chase you, right? And catch up with you, and then something disturbing happens. Which is pretty much what the story's about, right? Discuss the function of the secret Mrs. Doss reveals to Mr. Kapasi. This is number 7. In the end, does the scene make Mrs. Doss more sympathetic? Probably mixed, right? But the way that she says, I want, right? It's like there's no conscience there. Not I feel guilty, I shouldn't have done that, but I want to not hurt anymore, right? It's not that simple, right? And that kind of ties in with the theme of the story too. You can't just have this fantasy or ignore someone and make that guilt or hurt go away. It's more complicated than that, right? We have to solve problems, admit things to people, repair relationships like Mr. Kapasi probably needs to do with his wife, right? It sounds like they're kind of distant, and that's understandable. They lost a son, right? So there's a part of them that's kind of dead inside from that loss. Okay, last question. What does the ending suggest about Mr. Kapasi's future? Has his encounter with the Doss family created any permanent change in his outlook on his life or view of himself? Again, no certain answer, and definitely a mixed ending. It's not just happy or unhappy, but maybe it's a step toward him. Would it have been good if Mrs. Doss kept his address, whether he heard from her or not? Probably not, because then he's going to keep subconsciously pining after her, right? And thinking about this young woman, which is ridiculous. And if they corresponded, then that probably wouldn't have been good either, right? So is it better that she lost it? Well, maybe. Does that make it a happy ending? No. But it's appropriate, right? Because it kind of shows how it was unrealistic and how he needs to face up to his hurt and his guilt. Okay. So more of a hopeful suggestion that he can do that than for her, right? Although he did point out something to her that maybe could cause her to move forward and maybe admit what she did, but not nearly a concrete sign that that could happen as much as him, right? Okay, I'm going to pause here and then I'm going to come back and share some readers logs.